It's really like a huge pleasure and honor to introduce Jake today. I would say that Jake is probably the long-standing collaborator of mine and one of the closest collaborators. I've been working and following his research for the last 25 years. Jake is a professor of communication in the Department of Communication at the University of Arizona. For those of you who like academic trees, he obtained his PhD at the University of Santa Barbara under Howard Giles, and he's been in Arizona for a considerable period of time, developing a very innovative and interdisciplinary body of work that is highly cited and highly recognized at the interface of social psychology, integral psychology, communication, and also gerontology. For those in the integral content camp, you probably know Jake's work for his extensive and influential work on socially mediated and technologically mediated contact. His body of work around intergenerational contact is also very impressive. I think Jake, and I don't say it in a partisan way, but has got one of the finest intellect that I had the pleasure to come across. His work, his interest in basic processes which are contextualized and are rich, and it's really kind of a great pleasure to engage with. On a more personal note, I think Jake is just a great guy. It's una bella persona, we say in Italy. Very generous with his time, very humble and very approaching, and G will be probably testify on this side of things also from the junior perspective. I can testify that his passion for indirect forms of contact are part of also of his lifestyle. I like to recall this realization that it took us about 10 years to meet in person for the first time after working quite intensely together. So we met for the first time in 2011 in around the ESP in Stockholm. So anyway, Jake able to kind of be very generous academically and productive across time differences and modality of deployment. And I'm sure that is not going to surprise us today. On a more traditional metrics, Jake has got a very impressive track record. Is written or curated 8 important volumes, published more than 170 empirical and theoretical papers, won many awards, and with us we secured 3 large competitive grants, one of which is still active currently with also John Dixon at the interface of human geography and social psychology. One of which, the first one, I think it was important in establishing the idea of a negativity bias in contact effects. So an important legacy, and I'm hoping it's going to continue into the future. So thanks, Jake, so much for contributing to this series. And I'm looking forward to hearing about your more recent work on what music can do to engage through diversity across group divides. I pass you on the baton, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Steffi. Thank you all for being here. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen on Teams. All right, are we up and running? Okay. Thank you all again for being here. Like Steffi said, I am from the Department of Communication at the University of Arizona, and I'm going to talk a little about what music, partly, and also about work that I've been doing primarily with a recent PhD student of mine, Hyun-Chang Kim, on really focusing on what people do during contact, and trying to think a little about sort of the independent variable in contact theory research. Let's see. I've done a lot of work with Steffi. I'm not sure my talk can live up to her introduction that she just gave, but I'm not going to talk about any of our collaborative work because she would find that very dull, and a lot of you, I suspect, are familiar with Steffi's work. I do have a psychology background going back even further in the family tree than Steffi did. I was a psychology undergraduate at the University of Bristol in the late 1980s, shortly after Henri Tajfel died, but he was still a very big presence in that department. I was raised on social identity theory, and so that's really been an important driver of my work throughout my career. I think what being in a communication department has done is focused my attention on a lot of indirect and mediated forms of intergroup contact in particular, and also focused my attention on messages, on sort of trying to go inside kind of the black box of intergroup contact and think about what's going on in there, think about language processes, so things like self-disclosure, humor, patronizing talk between groups, accommodation of one sort or another, so how we adjust our language and communication depending on the group membership of who we're talking to. And more recently, sort of a focus or an interest in, like Steffi said, music. Why music? So part of my interest in music comes from just being a music fan and being someone who plays music a lot, plays music with various groups of people, some of which are very diverse. It's the only place where I get to mingle with Trump voters is when I go play music. So, you know, there's all sorts of interesting intergroup contact involved there. My sort of academic interest in music also stems from a news article I ran into a few years back, which was talking about this flute that they discovered in a cave in Germany, I believe, somewhere, which is about 40,000 years old. And the article sort of described how humans were living 40,000 years ago. And we were, you know, nomadic hunter-gatherers being, you know, chased down by wild animals and living a very rough lifestyle by contemporary standards, for sure. But we still spend our time apparently making flutes and playing them. So there's something going on there where music is important to humanity, and that it's been important to humanity for a very, very long time. Part of this is clearly, if you read the sort of anthropology and sociology of music culture, part of it is the importance of music in rituals, that when we get married, when we come of age, when we die, music is involved in all those things. When we engage in religious rituals, music is involved in those things. And so I feel like music is just very important as a social and collective activity. What does all that have to do with contact? I think music is important in intergroup contact, in part because it stimulates two complementary but quite different processes. Music pretty much universally popular music at least, has some sort of regular pulse to it. It is temporally organized in interesting ways, And people, again, pretty much universally across cultures, move to music. They synchronize with it, and when they're engaged with music collectively, they co-synchronize. Is co-synchronize a word? I don't know. Anyway, they synchronize together. Dance is the most obvious one, obvious manifestation of that. But even if we are not dancing to music, we are tapping our feet, we are swaying from side to side, and so I'm thinking about intergroup contexts where people are engaged with music and they are moving together in an organized way. And there's lots of psychological research showing how that when we synchronize with other people, we ourselves start to overlap a little bit, we empathize with them, etc. Speaking of empathy, the other thing that happens with music is that music is obviously a very emotional code of communication. In the music psychology literature, they talk about music being super expressive, meaning that it expresses emotions in more intense and profound ways than other forms of human communication. So playing music is more emotional than talking to someone, for instance, most of the time. And so again, if we think about intergroup contexts where people play music together, or listen to music together, or experience music together, there is a shared emotional experience that comes from that, and an awareness of that sharing of emotion. So empathy, again, I think is implicated pretty strongly there. So I'm going to talk about some research on music, but also thinking about music had led me, working again with Hyunchang Kim, to think about sort of activities more broadly. And so what do I mean by that? Let me give you a really terrible, sort of primitive characterization of the intergroup contact literature. Sort of a straw man would say that the intergroup contact literature says we have positive contact with some sort of outgroup member. That leads to presumably positive perceptions or impressions of that outgroup member, and that leads to positive outcomes concerning the outgroup, so generalization of some sort. A more activity-based novel, the kind of thing that I've been thinking about for the last few years, says that positive contact involves some sort of specific activity, which might be playing music with someone, it might be playing a board game with them, or it might be having a nice conversation. We don't know, but some sort of activity is occurring during contact. That should lead to perceptions of that outgroup member that are somewhat tied to the activity that we're engaged in. And those activity-related perceptions of the outgroup member should lead to some sort of outcomes, presumably positive if the activity was a positive one. And that those outcomes may also be related to the activity. So, for example, if we think about a white person having contact with an Asian person, maybe that white person runs into an Asian person who is a caring parent. They witness them or engage with them. They are nurturing their children in a really positive, caring, wonderful sort of way. That might lead to a sense of emotional connection to this person, or a perception that this person is warm. And that might lead to positive outcomes about Asian people, for instance, perceptions that Asian people are warm. On the other hand, the white person might run into a talented Asian breakdancer. That's unlikely to lead to perceptions that person is nurturing, but may well lead to perceptions that that person is physically talented, very coordinated. And if, there's music going or something like that, might lead to perceptions of behavioral synchronization with that person, which again might have positive implications for perceptions of Asian people as a group, but probably not perceptions of warmth, more like perceptions of, wow, they're better dancers than I thought they were. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about a couple of studies. I'm going to talk about two experiments primarily, looking at variations in intergroup contact activities and ensuing variation in specific mediators that are tied to those activities. These are all studies that are done with white American participants and looking at their attitudes about two different outgroups, Chinese people and refugees. All of them involve, so I should say that both of the studies that I'm going to talk about here and a lot of our recent work has involved all intergroup situations. So these aren't studies where we have a contact condition and a no contact condition. Everyone does contact. What we're interested in is different types of contact and the implications of that for mediators. So, but we have both of these studies involve pretest, post-test comparisons, which are significant. So overall, contact works in these studies. Which I think most people on this call probably know anyway, albeit some of the recent longitudinal stuff has all of us in an existential crisis, maybe. But in these studies, anyway, contact works. Okay, so the first study I'm going to talk about involves a comparison of contact that involves music and contact that involves a language learning activity. These are all indirect experiences. So people are watching a video of a Chinese person. These are, again, white American participants. A Chinese person either sharing a favorite song with them or sharing the Chinese language with them and teaching them a few words of the Chinese language. These activities were designed to be sort of quasi-interactive. So the actor in the videos introduces the song or the language and encourages the viewer to participate with her while she is teaching them about the experience. This particular study had the pretest occurred a week ahead of time, I should say. And so the sort of model we were looking at here was one where the musical contact was predicted to increase empathy towards the outgroup individual, the Chinese individual in the video, and that empathy was presumed to translate into positive outgroup attitudes. On the other hand, the language learning activity was predicted to increase perceived knowledge of the outgroup individual. She shares the language and how these words are used in Chinese culture. And so this negative sign on the A path from the independent variable to perceived knowledge, that's indicative of a positive effect for language learning, if that makes sense. It's just the coding of the categorical IV here that makes that a negative prediction. Let me see here. Okay, so I'm just going to play you little clips from the video to give you a little more of a sense of what participants experienced, and please wave frantically at me if you can't hear the sound. Oh, sorry. Okay, you get the idea. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button. So there was the language learning condition. She's teaching them the word. She explains the pronunciations. She tells them how the word is used in the culture. The music condition, she explains the pronunciation, and they encourages them to sing along. And she sort of walks them through the song. Okay. So what do the results look like here? These are parallel mediation analyses, so both mediators are in the analysis at the same time. As you can see, we find significant effects from the musical activity um, led to stronger feelings of empathy towards the actor than the language learning condition. And empathy was associated with more positive outgroup attitudes. That was a significant mediated effect. There was not a significant mediated effect for the language learning activity. That did not result in increased perceived knowledge of the outgroup individuals, although knowledge was associated with more positive outgroup attitudes. So an indication of the effects of music that we expected to find increased empathy translating into positive outgroup attitudes. Some indication that the activity that you engage in when you have positive contact has implications for the mechanisms through which that contact has its effects. Okay. Second experiment I want to talk about. We have three conditions here explicitly oriented around a sort of cognitive activity. In this case, again, language learning, with the prediction that that will lead to increased knowledge concerning the outgroup participant. And affective activity, in this case, an emotional disclosure, where the participant describes coming to the US and her feelings about that. And a behavioral activity where the actor teaches some dance moves. So this was an attempt partly to disentangle the synchronization elements of music and the empathy elements of music and see how they work separately. So music is not actually involved in this, but the dance was sort of a proxy for the rhythmic elements of music. The actor was depicted as a refugee who had recently come to the United States. And again, there were interactive elements here where she said things like, let's do this activity together. This was a three-wave study where we had the pretest a week beforehand. They had the experience where they watched the video and did an immediate post-test, and then there was a delayed post-test a week afterwards. So we had three experimental conditions, dummy-coded, three mediators, a cognitive mediator, an affective mediator, and a behavioral mediator. And obviously our prediction was, for instance, that with the cognitive activity, that would lead to increases in the cognitive mediator, knowledge about the outgroup individual. And that should lead particularly to cognitively emphasized outcomes, such as, for instance, group level knowledge. And obviously, we'd predict that the affective activity would lead to strengthened scores on the affective mediator, empathy, and that would perhaps have implications for an empathic outcome. Three different outcomes. Again, quick clips from the stimuli. don't quite have this Teams thing down yet. Okay, so again, we did parallel mediation analyses. All of the mediators were involved in the models. I'm just going to show you the significant effects that emerged. So we, in the immediate post-test, which is what we're looking at here, we found a significant indirect for the cognitive activity compared to the behavioral activity. So given that there are three conditions, we have sort of pairwise comparisons. So compared to the behavioral activity, the cognitive activity led to the cognitive activity, remember, was language learning, led to greater perceived knowledge of the outgroup individual than the dance condition, and that perceived knowledge about the individual was associated with reports of group level knowledge. So how much do you think you know about refugees, for instance? Similarly, we found significant indirect effects for the behavioral activity. That was the dance condition. That led to more perceived synchronization with the outgroup individual compared to both the other conditions, the cognitive and the affective condition. And perceived synchronization was associated with a group level behavioral intention, meaning how much would you like to have contact with refugees in the future? No effects for the emotional self-disclosure activity. There were no differences between that and the other two activities in terms of the affective mediator, which was empathy. Although, again, empathy was correlated with the group level empathy outcome. On the delayed post-test, a week later, the effects for the dance activity persisted, so we still have significant indirect effects where, you know, the first part of this model is the same thing because the mediators were measured immediately afterwards, but the mediator still was associated with reports of attitudes a week afterwards. So again, some indications here, not universally supported, but some indications that the activity that people engaged in with the outgroup member it is important in terms of the mechanisms through which contact influences broader perceptions of the outgroup. So this gives us a good idea that different activities have positive effects via different mechanisms, or in other words, just that positive contact is perhaps a complex thing, and that we maybe need to think a little more about that in terms of the different kinds of activities that people engage in when they are doing contact. Very briefly, one other study that we've been working on recently in my research team is a very different paradigm, but we've collected a large number of people's open-ended reports of positive experiences when they have musical contact with outgroups. So tell us about a time when you heard another culture's music and you enjoyed it, or you had a good time. And we've analyzed those using a combination of human coding and some AI coding. AI is wonderful for coding text data, apparently, it turns out, and develop various themes. I'm not going to talk about all of the themes, but I'm going to talk about or mention or draw your attention to a handful of them. There are a lot of reports in these data of eudaimonic experiences. So as opposed to the contact literature, which I think tends to focus on hedonic experiences, just positive, happy, good time kind of contact, There are a number of reports of people feeling spiritual or feeling transcendent or feeling elevated in various forms as a result of experiencing outgroup music. There are a lot of reports of relaxation, and the contact literature talks quite a bit about anxiety and reducing anxiety, but what we see in these reports is sort of the complement of that, which is actually feelings of relaxation, of calm. There are a number of reports of feeling directly a part of the other culture, or feeling very connected to the other culture as a result of the music. There are reports of direct participation in the other culture. So when we were all dancing, I felt included, and it was so much fun learning their traditional dance moves, for instance. So feeling actually in the other culture and doing the other culture as opposed to simply sort of observing or having contact. And we also found a lot of examples of people reporting kind of cross-cultural fusions and the ways in which those fusions provided sort of an entree to the other culture. So other cultures' music that contains Western elements to it, for instance. So even this one type of contact, very restricted form of contact, musical contact with another culture, there's really richness and a lot of depth in terms of the diversity of experiences that people are having. Or in other words, that positive contact is really complex. You're probably all familiar with the Tolstoy quote that happy families are all the same. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that happy contact is not all the same, that it's a lot of very different things, which I think is really cool to think about. And I think it's also complete chaos for those of us who want to do science on this, right? So we need some sort of organizing framework. I have developed such a framework for you today. Unfortunately, it's a framework that I developed this week while I was writing this talk. So I have no guarantees that this is anything sort of that's going to be useful in the future. But it's a sort of first idea. It's at least, I think, a demonstration that we might be able to make sense of all of the diversity in positive contact. So we do have a number of studies showing that these distinctions between cognitive and affective and behavioral seem to play out in terms of certain mediators. And I think we can often categorize contact situations in terms of the relative emphasis on these things. So some activities in the workplace, for instance, might emphasize cognitive elements. Activities like socializing, having fun with friends might emphasize affective elements. A lot of hobbies, sports, dancing, playing music have behavioral components to them. I don't think any activities are solely one or other of these, but the relative emphasis I think we can identify. One thing we've seen, I think, particularly in the open-ended responses, is that there are some distinctions here between contact experiences where people are operating in terms of very distinct intergroup identities, my group and your group. And those, I think, often occur kind of on my home turf and can involve indirect contact. But then there are a lot of these experiences that involve more kind of blurred intergroup identities. For instance, when things are occurring on the outgroup turf. So when people were describing intergroup musical contact that occurred in another culture, when they were studying abroad or when they were traveling, when they were tourists, They described much more experiences of being kind of in the culture and feeling a part of the culture, maybe even feeling welcomed by the outgroup. And these were often also direct kind of participatory experiences. So when people reported actually singing along with outgroup members or playing music directly with outgroup members. So if we look at those distinctions, I think we can identify particular types of mediators that might pop up and be more powerful as mechanisms for translating intergroup context effects. So for instance, if we look at affect and distinct intergroup identities, the second box down on the left, I think we have sort of traditional context theory research there, that we have positive contact, we have a good time, we like the outgroup member more, and that translates into positive effects on attitudes, for instance. Likewise, reducing anxiety, for instance, might occur there. But in situations where there's a more blurred intergroup identity, and those affective responses might involve more empathy and might involve the eudaimonic experiences, those eudaimonic experiences of feeling transcendence, of feeling elevated, for instance, those tended to occur when somebody was immersed in the outgroup culture and deeply involved with it, not simply sort of having distanced contact with it. So I think, again, this is just me trying to throw some stuff down to close the talk, not in a sense of complete chaos. But I think there are ways that we can organize contact experiences so that we can then say, okay, this particular mediator, this particular mechanism is the most likely one to yield outcomes in this particular kind of context. I think I'm going to wrap up there. I appreciate your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
I might pass on the baton to G, who is muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Jake, for a very inspiring talk. So I'm Jie. I'm Stephonia PhD student at Durham University. So I first met Jake through Steffi's introduction last year, and we are now working together on a project. Even though we haven't met in person yet, very long way to the US, but already
10
feels
years.
like
I need to wait 10 years before I'll meet anybody.
Yeah. 10 years later. Yeah. But it feels like I have known you for a long time. And Jake is very supportive in our group for the junior PhDs and very generous in sharing his ideas and insights to us. Yeah, so now is our discussion part. I see that there's no questions during the talk in chat. So now if anybody is free, feel free to raise questions.
Can I start with one?
Yeah,
Jake, one thing that I forgot to say in my introductory and your ending part just reminded me that I thought for me your Contact Space 2010 paper is an epitome of the way your brain function and push the envelopes in the literature. And if you're not familiar, I really recommend you to go and look at this paper. It basically also organizes variances in contact experiences across the face-to-face indirect modalities and organizes around the two key dimensions of degree of self-referentiality as well as communication richness, and has got a similar way of handling, which I really find it quite generative, of handling both prediction about mediation and moderation, which is exactly where you're going, I think, here with your new model. One question from me, because I was actually wondering that when you were showing us your stimulus material, whether some of the variances to do with the, and I don't know, here you put it kind of, it's connected with category salience, but basically I wonder whether it's more into the, into whether the distinction is, all the distinction will be in integral and incidental side of it. So where the left column is the distinction is integral to the activities, or is a more symmetrical kind of activity, and the right column is more incidental. You put it like the outgroup turf, but I don't know, it can be basically both way. It could be also that is nobody's turf, and just you become aware of the distinction while you're doing something that you're both interested in. I don't know, I was trying to map it. I went during the weekend, I was looking for a Buddhist center retreat, and I rock up at this gathering organized by Sri Lankan community here in the Northeast. And then I forgot to actually ascertain that the event would run in an English modality, and I was totally wrong. I spent 3/4 of a day in a completely Sri Lankan speaking environment, and lots of smiling and a lot of lovely people. Luckily, there were a Bangladeshi community segment who didn't speak any Sri Lankan, so they did a couple half an hour segment in English. And I was trying to map it against this idea, well, we all there because we were interested in Buddhism, and it ended up that there were people of different language communities, or vice versa. It was a Sri Lankan event, and there were some random, Italian and Bangladeshi. Anyway, I was wondering whether the integral and incidental, it can be perhaps a way in which that top dimension is describing the horizontal level. The other thing that came to mind when I look at, and I'll finish there, it's about who is driving the activity. And because in your stimulus material, it is in the outgroup turf, right? It's people introducing to their own language and perhaps their own music as well. And I wonder again whether power, in perception of power during the activity do matter. And the answer for me, it would be yes. And it can be quite transformative. And I leave it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think group salience, I think, is a very, very important concept in this, and I don't quite know how to tie it in. When we design the stimulus materials, we make them very, very group salient for obvious reasons. But yeah, I haven't thought about the incidental integral thing too much, but I certainly, yeah, the turf thing came from the music idea that we a lot of the responses that were more deeply immersed in the other culture were situations where people were on the outgroup's turf. They were visiting a friend's house, and they're Persian, and they were in another country. Even they were at a Mexican restaurant, and there was a mariachi band playing, and that was sort of very emotional to them because everyone around them was speaking Spanish, and they felt like they were really a part of the culture. Those experiences seem to be more profound in a sense, and so that was what led me to think about that distinction in that particular way. Yeah. I think there are a couple of hands up.
Yeah, hi, I think I'm first. Hi, Jake. My name's Libby Drury, and I do...
Libby, we can't hear you very well.
You can't, can you hear me any better now?
Better, yeah,
Okay,
better.
thank you, Stefania. Hi, Jake. Yeah, I do research on intergenerational contacts. I'm a great
Yeah, I know your work.
Okay, great. I'm a great admirer of your work. And I also do work on workplace contact for older and younger workers. So this is, all of your work is very interesting to me. One thing I wanted to ask you a question about was about the non-effectiveness of the emotional disclosure in the second study that you mentioned, and if you could give me any thoughts on why you thought that didn't work.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and you know, again, the pre-test, post-test worked, quote unquote. So the contact worked, but emotional disclosure did not have effects above and beyond the other contact conditions. I don't know if I mean, one possibility is that the other contact conditions also inspired feelings of empathy and connection to the outgroup member. The dance condition, I don't know, she looks like she's having fun, so maybe that inspires empathy. The language learning condition, she's describing aspects of the culture along with teaching the words. And so part of it may not be so much that it wasn't effective, but that the other conditions were somehow equally effective. And it is, I mean, one thing we learned, we went into this study thinking, oh, we'll have a cognitive condition, an affective condition, and a behavioral condition. And hey, you know, big surprise, there's no such thing. And they, you know, as soon as we start designing or trying to design an emotional condition, an affective condition, we realize that, well, but there's also learning that's involved in that. So it's also got cognitive elements. So I suspect that's a part of it. And, you know, a story about refugees, it may also be that these were a mix of undergraduates and prolific respondents, cloud respondents. It may just be they didn't connect to her story in quite the way that we intended.
Could I ask you unless I missed it, sorry, what the disclosure was from an emotional perspective? Was it?
She was disclosing. It wasn't necessarily happy. She was disclosing about her experiences when she first arrived in the United States as a refugee. And so some of it was happy in terms of describing, you know, being happy to be here. But also she was describing feeling a little bit lost and uncertain how to behave in new contexts.
Yeah. And how do you think it maps onto sort of traditional self-disclosure?
Yeah, it was very, very much a fairly deep level of self-disclosure. So she was involved in talking about her feelings, feeling scared, feeling lost, like I said. So yeah, I think it would fit within the self-disclosure literature as a, you know, I don't know what theory we're using here. If you're talking like the onion model, we're fairly deep into the onion.
Great, thanks for the analogy. Thanks very much, Jake.
Rita?
Hi, Jake. Thank you so much for the talk. I have just, I think it's one question with two within. It's curious that I teach a course on intergroup contact, 12 hours, so I'm quite lucky. And this was actually one of the papers that we included this year, and students were very excited about it when we talked, when we discussed it in class. And then we had a couple of discussions around it. And I was just wondering if this taxonomy that you just presented here that was not in the paper, which I think is very interesting, if you think that this would kind of work in the same way for, you know, advantage and disadvantage groups. So when we talked about in class about the famous status asymmetry and valence asymmetry and all of that, you know, it popped up to my mind this kind of this three-parted structure of, you know, cognition, affect, behavior, and all of this. And this distinction that you made between the, you know, blurring and salience identities, if this would replicate for both, you know, high power, low power groups, and also if this would kind of make sense as well, if we think of negative contact as also a very complex thing, or, you know, should we think about negative contact as way more simpler, way simpler than positive one, and maybe just with this effective behavioral thing and less of the cognition? I don't know, just how should we shovel, you know, this asymmetry aspect for both status and valence in this taxonomy, if this makes any sense to you or not?
Yeah. Actually, Steffi and Anna and a couple of us were this last week involved in just discussing diversity and negative contact in terms of whether we wanted to represent it as involving a physical altercation, for instance. Remember the stool? So yeah, I think I'm sure negative contact is also complex. Maybe it's just because I've been thinking so much about positive contact. I think positive contact might be more complex, perhaps.
Yeah.
At least in the sense that positive contact continues, whereas negative contact, you're likely to leave, right? You're likely to self-select out of it. Whereas positive contact, you continue to engage it, and so it develops more complexity, perhaps. You know, when I was trying to throw that taxonomy together this last week, I did, on multiple occasions, it struck me that I was thinking from the perspective of the dominant group when I was putting it together. Like, I think especially the turf issue totally would not work for the subordinate group, right? That being on the dominant group's turf will not lead to feelings of being welcomed or immersed in this wonderful culture. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and we would need to think quite differently about some of that element of it. I think the idea that more generally that positive contact is very complex, and that the mechanisms through which positive contact has effects are related to what's going on in the contact. I think that would translate just fine. But yes, the taxonomy, or, you know, random model that I threw together, depending on what you want to call it, I think that would need some really careful consideration of status differences, for sure, and power. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll dive into it again next year when I'm teaching the same class, and maybe have some more studies that I can include. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.